Welcome to MedTech Disruptors. My name is David Philby. I'm the founder of Elevra Consulting. On this show, we interview commercial leaders who have taken a disruptive technology from early phase through to launch or even merger and acquisition. It's all about the journey, the highs and the lows, how to create new markets, what is high performance culture, the risks and rewards, and leading commercial teams in growth companies. We hope this gives you good insight and advice on how to advance your own career. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy the show. This week we were joined by Mark Maire, who was most recently the CEO of Cassini Technologies, and we focused on his time with TrueVision, a disruptive ophthalmology product that went from being developed in a garage to an acquisition of $150 million by Alcon. It's an incredible story of mistakes being made, how to pick yourself up again, and eventually win. Let's get into it. Welcome, Mark, thank you for joining me today on the podcast. I'm super excited to...
Great to be here.
Yeah, I've been really excited to talk to you about this because when we first spoke and we talked for a long time, it was a really, really enjoyable conversation, but we went down this, I guess, down memory lane, and we were talking about your career and what you've done, and the story of TrueVision came up. And on paper, it's the story that everybody wants to be able to tell. Disruptive technology, massive acquisition, and the headlines are always, one thing, and the actual story is completely different. And that's what this podcast is all about, is being able to learn those stories. So this feels like a perfect fit. I'm super excited to get into it. But for the benefit of people listening, it'd be great for you to introduce yourself, who you are, what you've done, and what we're doing.
You bet. Again, my name is Mark Maire. Been in ophthalmology since the early 90s. Had a couple of career detours in there, but I think all of that, everything that you do builds you to the better you that is able to contribute to a company. I have, besides ophthalmology, had some detours into neurosurgery, which we can certainly discuss, and different levels of influence within organizations, and certainly always trying to learn and stay abreast on new technologies and how other people have been successful. So it's great to meet you and work with you on some of this stuff, but it'll be fun here to talk a little bit about what we've done in the past in our careers and certainly in the startup world.
100%. So the one that we don't like to do is tell life stories because everyone finds them boring. We love to tell chapters of the story that are the most exciting parts, and your part is super exciting. TrueVision took that disruptive technology, innovative technology, something that didn't exist, and brought it to market. But I think before we tell the story, it'd be great if you could just tell us about the product. What was the technology? What was that product?
Yeah, so TrueVision, the product, and as we started to say, the unmet medical need that we were working on was solving for the ergonomic issues of microsurgery. And specifically because we came from a background in ophthalmology, and ophthalmologists, I think the American Academy of Ophthalmology did a study, and they showed that over 74% of surgeons reaching the age of 55 had career-limiting neck and back issues from sitting at a microscope like this and horrible posture. People have manufactured different types of oculars over the years. Leica's got a set called Ultra Lows that try and keep your neck in a better position. Zeiss did these 0 to 180s that would hopefully keep you in a better position. And people use them either improperly or in just long days, and you still have these career-limiting neck and back issues. So the TrueVision product was really designed to have surgeons be able to utilize their microscope. We simply took the oculars off and put our three-dimensional camera on, so we were getting both eyes simultaneously in high definition, and then sending that to originally it was a rear projection system. Ultimately, 3D TVs came out, and then it was to a 3D monitor, and we settled on a 55-inch monitor. So the surgeons now could sit back comfortably with good posture and be able to operate looking at the screen. And that was essentially where we were going with that technology, and that was the problem that we were trying to solve. Now, once you have things in a digital format, everything becomes possible. So you can do things like surgical guidance and navigation. You can bring in all kinds of patient information. You can bring in information about the systems that you're using in the operating room. In the case of cataract surgery, the phaco machine, those settings, being able to bring in charts and all kinds of information. And so it really started to change. We were really on the forefront of being able to supply surgeons with the information that they need at the place where they need it, which is in the operating room during surgery, so that they could have everything about the patient right there at their fingertips or directly in front of their faces, the case may be.
So the original purpose of the product was to extend the surgeon's professional career, that their ability to perform surgery um, through better ergonomics.
Right.
But actually, an additional benefit once created was because it was now a digital viewing point, you could merge it with other technologies and other analytics and data and so forth to actually improve the quality of the surgery itself.
Absolutely. And that was the fun, really, we had such a great time. One of the consultants that we were working with, guy's a vice president at Star Surgical now, but his name is David Fries. David was consulting to a company out of The Hague in the Netherlands that had created a device that did a marvelous job of measuring the cornea, the Cassini. And so we partnered with them, and we took those measurements from the cornea, put it into our guidance software, and then using augmented reality, we did an overlay and showed exactly where the axis of astigmatism was and where the surgeons needed to make their incisions into the eye for cataract surgery. And as you can imagine, sort of the line that we've always used is if you push a wall down in your house, the roof or the ceiling's going to come down there. If you stick a knife in someone's eye, you've just changed the shape of the cornea. And that is called surgically induced astigmatism. And so if you know roughly how much astigmatism you're inducing as a surgeon, we can now put that as part of the calculation. So our first offering for doing augmented reality and being able to improve patient outcomes was this overlay that showed the surgeons, here's where you want to make your incision, here's where you're going to line up the toric lens, and as a result of all of that, the residual astigmatism for the patient will be X. And they could then move their incision point around. They could look and see what a different lens would do for them. And we recalculated all of that for them in real time. And so that was a huge step forward. There were other companies like Alcon who ultimately ended up acquiring us, Zeiss, some other folks who came up with ideas like that shortly behind us. And their software was, in my estimation, a little more cumbersome and more difficult to work with. But they had the monster sales force, and we were a sales force of two people running across the United States trying to hustle this. So it was neat to get on the roadmap. and to show people what we could do, and to get all of the input from our key opinion leaders on what we should do next and what would be of real value to them. But boy, it was certainly tough going up against the bigger guys out there, and trying to win those deals.
That's awesome. The initial stat that you mentioned, 74% of 55
Yeah.
at 55 years old, surgeons have got career potentially ending injuries. Do you know what that number is now and what the sort of impact of the improvement in technologies has been?
Yeah, I think that, there have been a lot of movement since the acquisition of TrueVision by Alcon.
Yeah.
And Zeiss has come up with a new system. Bosch and Lomb is selling a system that was designed by Heidelberg and MSI. So there are, and there's an Israeli company called Bionics, and you put on a helmet like the fighter pilots use. As a matter of fact, it came from fighter pilots from the F-35.
Oh, wow.
And all of those are designed to solve this same problem.
Mm,
Whether ergonomically speaking, the numbers have changed, I have not seen that. And I know that in that market, there we're still really in that first front end of the bell curve. I think that the innovators and the early adopters are pretty much on board, which make up 16% of any market. But it's trying to get to that early majority. That's really where the challenge lies. Alcon has a real good grip on the teaching institutions. They have wisely gotten into a lot of the major teaching institutions. And so the benefits of the 3D visualization, just from a teaching aspect, because now you don't just have the surgeon and the attending, or the attending surgeon rather, and the resident or fellow on the microscope, and everybody else is looking at some little 2D monitor
yeah.
up in the corner of the operating room. They have no idea what's really going on.
Mm,
Now everyone in the operating room is looking at a 55-inch 3D monitor in 4K, and they're able to actually see exactly what the surgeon is seeing as the surgeon is seeing it. And so we're doing a lot more on the education front, but are those residents leaving their residency and going out and demanding 3D heads up surgery? Uh, I think in some cases, yes. And those surgeons will have a nice, long, and healthy career. And I'm sure in some cases that's not at the top of their list. And so, I don't know that the ergonomic needle has moved much.
it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because do are the surgeons demanding it, or are institutions changing over time, realizing that the people that they're employing and wanting to retain are trained on certain things and therefore need to invest in those types of technologies? Because I remember, so I'll try and keep this brief because it's a tangent, but I studied at university level network engineering, and the famous Cisco were the global leader in network components, and Cisco, when they first came to market with their products, their routers and so forth, routers for the American
For
listener,
the Americans.
uh, um, were not the best product on the market, but they targeted technology universities and got all students across the US to be trained on Cisco equipment so that this is when the internet was breaking out in the
Sure.
90s and so forth, when companies were trying to hire the best graduates who are trained in how to code and set up networks, they only knew Cisco, so they then had to buy Cisco equipment for their networks, and that was how they took market share. It's a really interesting commercialization strategy, I suppose,
Yeah.
but what an interesting dynamic if Alcon go down that education route to be the market leader.
Yeah, and I think that human nature is the same regardless of your level in life and goals, and human nature just is what it is. And I always told doctors who were very interested in the technology but worked in a larger practice. Chairman of an ophthalmology department, but he's got 16 other attending surgeons that are there, plus all of the kids that they're teaching, residents they're teaching.
Yeah.
At my age, I get to say kids, and it's it's the same as your dinner table at the holidays. You've got that crazy uncle who will stand in 37-degree rain to get the latest and greatest iPhone. And you've
Mm.
got, in my case, my mother, who still wishes that we had rotary phones,
Mm.
and, doesn't want anything to do with it. And everything in between. And
Mm.
I remember when we were going through the first part of the agreement with Alcon was that they were going to distribute the product for the first couple of years. And then if things were going successfully, they would end up doing the acquisition. So there were, sort of minor successes kind of along the way.
Yeah.
And I saw that within their sales force, you had those sales guys who were super excited about new technology and just thought now I've got something new and wonderful that I get to go and talk to my customers about. And
Yeah.
we had guys on the other side of that were, and it was all male sales force at Alcon, so I can say guys.
Mm.
They had that were, literally sending text messages saying, if you use this technology, you'll go blind. Saw those texts.
Why
Um,
was that though? What was the sort
it's
of
just the desire not to be embarrassed in front of your customers with
mm.
something that you don't understand, and
Mm.
the technology. You and I sort of fell into this group. You're a younger man than me, and so technology was sort of always part of your experience.
Sure.
But for those in our 50s, it was, coming out, you're graduating from
Yeah.
high school in the mid to late 80s, and so personal computers weren't really a thing yet. So you were either going to the computer lab and learning this sort of thing, or
Yeah.
you were going out to practice baseball or football, or you're playing your sport.
Mm.
And those tended to be different people. And of
Mm.
course, the people that all tended to wind up in sales were athletes who, got exposed to a lot of people, and
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
that sort of outgoing and gregariousness. Um, but they weren't the guys that were sitting in the computer lab.
They
And
feared
so,
technology.
yeah. And so it just became going through your career. And as new technologies came out, your company would sort of feed you the information that you needed to have in order to be successful. So, could they run a computerized phacoemulsification machine that removes the cataract? Absolutely. Could they make their phone do anything more than answer a phone call and text? No, because they
Mm.
weren't given those tools and they didn't need to learn them, and they weren't going to spend the time on that, because they were good sales guys and they were out selling. But I think those positions have changed, you really need to be more technical and be embracing this and having it be part of what you do every day in your life. Learn some new technology for 10 or 15 minutes every day and try and incorporate that into your life. And that is the world that we live in now. Back then, that wasn't really the case. And so it was fun working with those sales guys who embraced the technology and wanted to take it out to their customers. And it was painful dealing with the ones who were just convinced this was a colossal waste of time, and had no interest in going out and sharing that. And unfortunately, these could be some of the top sales guys in the
Right.
organization that just simply
Highly
had a
influential.
fear of technology. Yeah.
Mm. It's so interesting. The I get asked this question by ex-colleagues and people that reported to me and stuff like that, who maybe now are in management roles or started their own companies even, and they always say, when you're interviewing to hire, what do you look for? And I answer that question differently every day. You could ask me the questions today, I'll say one thing. Tomorrow, I'll probably say something different. But for me, that sweet spot, I summarize it as the charming nerd, because I think if you're going to be a great salesperson, you've got to have you've got to you've got to be a people person. You've got to have high emotional intelligence and everything else in between. Um, but you've got to be able to get nerdy. You've got to be able to have passion for the product and learn about it and immerse yourself in it for the benefit of you, but for also for the benefit of your customer. If you can't be that technical, you're never going to be the surgeon,
Right.
but you've got to try and have empathy and show that it's not empathy for the sake of the sale. It's empathy because you actually are now in love with that product because you were immersed in it for 10 years.
Yeah.
Um, that's the modern day salesman, that's just the way it has to be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that the where things are going now, especially with AI and a lot of the new technologies, you're never going to be the surgeon, but
Right.
you can impact and have a huge influence over how the surgery is performed and how what that outcome is going to look like. And the surgeons, when you make their careers better and you improve their outcomes, they're your customers literally for life. And it is the thing that is so hard to explain to younger sales guys that
Yeah.
you have this opportunity. And in the early days, LASIK wasn't approved in the United States, and so
Yeah.
we were running surgeons back and forth. At the time, I was with a company called Chiron Vision, and so we were running surgeons back and forth to Canada to get trained on being able to do LASIK because we knew the FDA was going to approve LASIK. We knew all that was coming. And so for them to go with them and watch their eyes light up and to really sit there and see the wheels spinning and know that where they were going with that technology in order to improve the lives of their patients once that was going to be approved, that was really the big aha moment for me, was seeing exactly what it was that we were doing, because I knew there was interest in LASIK, and I knew, we're okay. In Beacon, Michigan, this was easy to run across over to
Yeah.
Windsor, and that was where one of the largest LASIK practices was, and to watch that happen. But it was really starting to see the light bulbs go on that this was improving people's lives, and now I was starting to get a little bit of the benefit of having taught that surgeon that it was easier to see them. It was easier for me to be able to show them another product and something else because I had helped them on this other front. And
Mm.
and so the more I stayed up to speed on the technologies, and back then it became clear corneal incisions, and so we were selling diamond knives, and helping there. And then they were looking at clearer corneas because of the another product that we sold that coated the inside of the cornea better, but it was easy to get out, so you didn't have the pressure spikes. I mean, I'm getting a little bit esoteric here and off into the weeds, but it was constantly moving these surgeons along that started to build up that gratitude that they had toward seeing us because we were helping them improve their outcomes. And
Mm.
once we got to TrueVision, that really became, now I'm improving not only your life because you're going to not be miserable when you get out of surgery all day, but we've now recorded these cases in 3D. And now we can show these cases at meetings, big meetings, the academy meetings. We can show them at regional meetings. And back then, when 3D was just, people were going to a meeting and putting on the 3D glasses and watching something and seeing the depth and understanding what people were doing, you were a rock star if you were that guy at the podium that was
Mm.
showing this. And literally, one of my favorite surgeons is a guy down in Florida named Rob Weinstock. His entire career was made by TrueVision. And that's not patting myself on the back. He embraced the technology. A guy out of Cincinnati, a retina surgeon named Chris Riemann, another, huge innovator, but it was the TrueVision technology and him being able to show this at meetings and show his techniques and what great hands he had. That really moved his career forward. So it was fun watching other people who were not quite the innovators, but they were early adopters, seeing that these guys were getting on stage and on the podium, then they started to gravitate towards technology, and then that snowball just starts to roll. And that's
Mm.
when we got the interest from Alcon, was that once you have those key opinion leaders talking about not only the ergonomic benefits, but the fact that they can see more. Now this is meets that unmet medical need that was such a requirement from the R&D departments that, if we're going to invest time and energy, this has got to be moving the ball forward. We're like, hey, we're moving the ball forward.
Wow.
Listen to what these guys are saying.
So let's take it back to the start because we're sort of now getting close to the end, right? So I want to go. Let's go back to because you mentioned this briefly. Um, when you joined True Vision, what was your role, and what did the commercial department look like, and what was its what was its strategy, or if it had one, what was its firepower in terms of bringing the product to market?
Yeah, there was my former boss from iLab in Chiron had joined TrueVision after another startup that he had been with. He left them, and they were at that point in time. It was 2008 when I joined, June of 2008. The company had been developed in early 2006. Excuse me, and it was literally the garage, and the guy's name was Dr. Mike Weissman, brilliant guy. He had worked for stores and had created a three-dimensional endoscope. And he told the folks at stores, and this was their facility in Santa Barbara, California, he had said, hey, look, what we just did in endoscopy, we need to be able to do in microscopy. And they didn't see it. So like any good innovator and creator of technologies, he started his own company in the garage.
Mm.
And he and the other co-founder started building this technology together. They hired a couple of people to help them try and commercialize it, raise money, do those things. And so by the time we got to 2008, when I joined, the technology was in a tower computer. It sat inside a cart that was built at the from the Home Depot. It had two 1080p projectors stacked on top of each other, and you snapped out a 42-inch silver screen. The whole thing took up about 7 feet, and then you would
And just duct tape everywhere.
everywhere. And you would align these two projectors. If you bumped into it, the alignment got out of alignment, and so you'd have to be back there realigning the image. And that was the first technology. So when I joined, we were throwing these things in the back of minivans and just driving to anybody who would be interested in trying the technology. Um, Going into hospitals because we really thought that the image was going to be good enough for surgeons in a hospital setting to be able to utilize the technology and train residents and do
Mm.
those kinds of things. And the moment that we got into these settings and you set this thing up in the corner, and it took up so much room in these small operating rooms, the staff just threw you out. I mean, it was just, you barely even got a chance to turn the thing on, and circulating nurse or someone would walk by and say, out, and you were done. So
Why is that? It was that just because
it
they
was,
were being. Oh.
it was so disruptive, right? I mean, if this was by definition disruptive technology, The staff
Not
couldn't.
positively
Yeah,
disruptive,
right.
just
Yeah,
in
it's
the
just
way
disruptive.
disruptive.
Yeah, the staff couldn't stand where they normally stood. The flow in the operating room changed. The surgeon now is trying to look around people. We didn't know where it needed to be. They couldn't see what was going on. So if you even started the case, they were a couple of minutes into it before they were saying, "I need my oculars back again," and then you had to, take all the Velcro off of the microscope and pull the camera off, and yeah, it was just it was a real challenge trying to figure out where that sweet spot was. But the savior to us early on was we got 3D flat monitors came out 2009. We started really implementing them end of 2009, 2010. And so now, while the disruptions were still pretty much the same, that the staff couldn't stand where they used to stand and you had to kind of change the floor of the operating room, at least you weren't eating up so much space in the operating room that they couldn't maneuver, and the image quality stayed fairly consistent because you weren't banging around the projectors. So that helped things out a lot.
What was it in them early days? There's only a couple of you on the road bringing these
Two of us,
demos.
yeah.
Two of you. Um, what do you think is it about the personality traits and character it takes, to actually succeed in that sort of, environment where you are completely unknown, disruptive in terms of, this is a pain to just to demo. People aren't necessarily open-minded. It's a new technology, so it's inevitably there's an education to it that, you're not calling up someone, they go, oh yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
It's there's an education process to it. What do you think, as a customer facing person, what do you think are the character traits that made you successful, or made the product successful? Because it has there's a the human element of making that happen is so important.
Um, so I have had an unhealthy fear of failure.
Mm.
And so but in my case, the failures caused me to work harder to try and never do that again. But it was
Mm.
never enough that it kept me, from actually doing the job and getting, as Teddy Roosevelt said, back in the arena. I continued to go back in and not, use what didn't work the last time to try and win this next one. And it was the constantly getting back in and back at bat and trying to build on all of that. And David, my boss at the time, because I had come in as the East Coast director, and Dave was a VP of sales, so he was kind of covering the West Coast, and I was covering the East Coast. And then we both just were all over the place. And then ultimately David left, and I took over as VP of sales. Um, the what we found was that you had to just be able to dust yourself off and get back into the fight again and again and again. And so that was really the quality that we were looking for. We did not recognize that right away. We made some bad hires, hired people from big companies,
Right.
because we thought, well, they're going to know everybody. But
Yeah.
what we found was that they were really comfortable with a polished and completed product that everybody needed, and the phone rang, and they did not have to go out and do cold calling and those kinds of things. So it was a lot of, it was just a lot of trial and error, which I know is the case with every startup out there. Ours wasn't any different. It was just the cost of having to go into these organizations and ship equipment in and fly in and do these demos. You started to really do a great job of qualifying leads. And so if you talk to somebody and they said, yeah, I'd be interested in trying it, it was interested in trying it, interested in buying it. Because if this thing goes well, I'm going to expect that you're going to write me a check for this. Are we on the same page? And you could quickly start to figure out who just wanted to kick tires and who was actually thinking that I need this to work for me. And our very first customers were surgeons that either had to make this work for them or they were done operating. That's the motivation that I was after. I needed that. Give
Mm.
me that opportunity and I'll make the technology sing for you. But if this is just yeah, if it's neat, I'll do it. But otherwise, there's no reason for me to make a change. They were never changing.
So that's fascinating. So actually, the when you say qualifying leads, what you actually found was the reason it was going to be successful was actually the original purpose that you created it, where surgeons were saying, I need this to extend my career and the ability to operate. This could be the dream, not the people who go, that sounds like a nice idea.
Right.
I would be interested. So it's that massive sales difference between need and want, and it's so fascinating that the original purpose was the actual reason that you would pursue certain and pursue success that way. That's fascinating.
And in my first career out of college selling office equipment, they in the sales trainings they were always like, find their pain. Well,
Yeah.
in this case, I found their pain. It's their neck and back, and it is physical and literal and a driving force.
Yeah.
So we when we started finding those people, the more people would then come out and say, "Yeah, me too." And
Mm.
there was um, a certain macho, I'm okay, I can tough it out kind of a thing that was going on
Naivety.
initially. Yeah, that they didn't need this. I'll just, my dad was a surgeon and, granted, he can't walk straight anymore. And you see these older ophthalmologists out there with their heads all bent down because of years of being on not only surgical microscopes, but they've got the same problem in the clinic. They're on these devices and having to look at through slit lamps and other devices at patients' eyes and the wear and tear on their neck. So at least we could solve problems for them in the operating room. There is other technology coming now for the clinic, but
Right.
in the operating room, that was where I could try and help them. And so as you started to see more and more people making that switch over to operating heads up, and looking at the TrueVision screen, you started to have more and more people coming out of the woodwork saying, I need this too, where they
Mm.
were putting on a brave face, a month ago or a year ago.
But that must take a long time to get to the level of referral and reputation and the sort of almost a network effect of a great product
Yeah.
with case studies, proof of concepts, right?
Yep.
It's funny what you mentioned about hiring people out of big companies thinking they would bring a network with them. I hear this so many times. I don't think it matters what industry. I've made this mistake personally, hiring someone because of the network, the little black book that they could bring, and it gets you excited, doesn't it? You're interviewing them, and they go, "Well, I know all these people. They'll come with me." Blah blah blah. And you think, "Yeah, this is a slam dunk." I just like that's one of the reasons that hires fail the most is hiring people because of their network and not because of the principles and values that they share that actually makes them successful. I hear that so often.
Yeah.
I think every startup has to make that mistake because it's too easy to get excited by someone boasting about their network and their client base that they can bring with them. They join and then it's like they just rely on that. They're not actually willing to do the work. And exactly back to your point, the trial and error of making a new disruptive technology successful in the marketplace.
Right. And I found a wonderful sales guy who was my real partner in all of this, Chad Scarlett. When Chad came on board, I was really struggling with trying to understand who our target market was because we were essentially getting lucky and very unlucky in the way that we were approaching the market. If we sold one, it was sort of we just happened to turn up the right lead. But we were trying to sell systems to people that we should not have been trying to sell systems to. And
Yeah.
Chad was the first person, you've just got to bring in those fresh eyes, right? And he looked at the situation, looked at what we were doing, and said, I've kind of scored where people are. And the people who score the highest here are not the people that are in the current funnel. These people score very low on their ability to not only bring in new technologies, but the things that they have done in their lives. So I always wanted to try and find what Chad discovered was find those innovators who are like us, innovating on
Mm.
technology. They're the ones who have got the latest and greatest phones. They're the ones who are talking about doing the latest techniques and procedures. They're the ones who are going to all of the meetings and want to be on the podium. Those became our audience. And it got to the point where there was a big meeting in the early January down in Florida. A surgeon named Bobby Osher put together called Telling It Like It Is, and his audience were all of these surgeons who were just sort of up and coming and out of residency, smaller practices, but the key opinion leaders, the ones up on stage, were all of my people, and these were my customers up there. And so we struggled with going to that meeting because it was like we're not getting to the 500 out in the audience. We've already gotten those folks that are on stage. How do we get to more of those folks? And that really changed the trajectory of the business so that we were going to these meetings, and instead of trying to present to the masses, we were presenting to the folks up on the podium and showing them how this technology had all of these benefits for them from ergonomics and visualization, but it was going to help them in their career, and they're presenting their ideas because people could now follow along better. And that became that whole next wave of surgeons that we got. It was a fun understanding, and I'm grateful to Chad for bringing that.
Do you think conferences and meetups like that today still have the same impact as they did back then? It sounded like because you guys had a lot of success by meetings at conferences and approaching an audience, but do you think they have the same impact now?
I think that there are technologies that are more appropriate for those meetings than others. And one of the mistakes that I made, I always say that my career's been built on failure. But one of the mistakes that I made really early on was I did a presentation with one of my neurosurgeon friends, because neurosurgery turned out to be the second uh, avenue of our business. I went out to a meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the chairman of the neurosurgery department down at Emory is a guy named Dan Barrow, just a phenomenal human being, but a great surgeon. And Dan was an early adopter of the technology, and he wanted to show a neurovascular case, and we had recorded everything for him and edited all of it up. And I flew in and had this room full of these key opinion leaders. This is my target audience. But because we were a startup and things were so expensive, we could not afford the $700 a night that it cost to stay in the hotel, because it was the Four Seasons in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Mm.
And so I flew in, I did the presentation, and I left. And I got a number of leads, and so there were a couple of surgeons who said, bring it in. And you start looking at the cost of going and doing those demos, and it was $2,500, 3 grand, depending upon where they were. But just shipping the equipment in, airplane, flying in, having to do the demo, the hotel rooms, eating, all of that, all of the expense. It was 2,500, 3 grand to do each one of those. And I thought that was stupid to leave Jackson Hole where I was for $700 a night. I had everybody that I needed to see in one room, but being short sighted and saying, I got to get out of here because this is such an expensive place. Bad idea. So anyway, so the meetings matter. The attendees of those meetings matter, and what you're pushing and to whom you're pushing that technology is ultimately the decision that you've got to make. Are you trying to get the 500 people who are going to the meeting just to see, or are you trying to get those key opinion leaders that are up on stage? And if so, go where they go. And
Mm.
that really becomes I think the decision making for startups, that have a very limited budget. Where are you going to spend those dollars for the best impact? And these giant meetings like the American Academy of Ophthalmology or the American Society for Cataract and Refractive Surgeons and that sort of thing, these halls are so huge that
Right.
unless you've got some big breakthrough, this is not money well spent.
Interesting, isn't it? Because people would associate the size and scale of those meetups that this is it. We just have to turn up, and actually you just get lost in the noise.
That's it.
Um, with cost because it's important. Like startup, did you did you have a sort of a thing on your back about, how big was the cash runway, and did it ever get scary in terms of, if we don't sell some soon, we're going to run out of time to be able to do more demos, and every demo was experienced. Was that a concern?
Constant. And
Mm,
I know I heard horror stories, from the guys in Santa Barbara where the corporate office was, and I'm just out doing demos and flying around. And of course, every sale, and we were, trying to get 40, 50 grand, 60 grand for a system. And taking essentially whatever we could get just to try and help with cash flow, but that
right.
was nowhere near enough to cover what was probably at the time 350, $400,000 burn.
Mm,
And of course, as the company grew, that burn got to be, well north of a $500,000 a month. And I remember talking with my chief operating officer that, they were passing the hat just amongst the executives sitting in the building trying to come up with enough money to make rent because the sheriff was coming to, put a padlock on the doors. And those are not stories that you want to tell to the staff
mm,
while it's happening, but they're great stories, after the fact, and you've had a successful exit, and everything is great. So now we can tell these horror stories. But yeah, I mean, I was writing checks later on in my career there, just trying to keep the doors open. Because
wow.
sales were never going to fund the organization until we got to our partner strategy.
Mm. So it was about selling enough for proof of concept, and then you needed a big partner to come in and be able to implement, distribution at scale.
Yes.
Um, that makes sense. So before we get on to I guess the transaction and the partnership, those early days, what was the culture like of the company? What was it like, between the technologists and the commercials and so forth? But what was the culture like in those early years?
The original CEO, who turned out to be our chief operating officer, a guy named Rob Reale, had been through a number of startups. And Rob is just one of the nicest people. Has a low threshold um, for people not producing and handing him a bunch of nonsense. So he was quick to be able to get rid of that kind of stuff, so that we had people that were actually producing well. When Rob took on the chief operating officer role, he really helped get the organization organized well. Our chief technology officer is a dear friend of mine now, and Burton wound up being CEO of the organization as we managed to get to the exit. But Burton's team were super smart. Burton has a PhD from Caltech in applied physics. I mean, he's singularly the smartest guy,
Mm.
and Burton had the ability to bring in that kind of talent and to be able to get the most out of them. So the culture was really one of getting a lot done and being on that bleeding edge. And it was really, in hindsight, it was the fuel that those folks used were the stories from being out on the road, and so I would put together either emails or back then Skype was a new thing. I would be Skyping into the office and talking to the development team about what people saw, how they used it. I started shooting a lot of videos, and showing those videos of how the technology was being used, back to the development team. And so they really fed on that. But of course, the culture that Burton and Rob built allowed for people to really bring their best to the organization. And that was a lesson that, it's one of those that you're too down in the mud during all of it to recognize what's going on, but looking back on it and seeing how things actually got accomplished, I credit the two of them for having that kind of ability to set a culture where people could thrive and really deliver on the technology and make the company better.
That's awesome. So then let's talk about the transaction and partnership itself, the build up to it, the purpose of it. I think you've already touched on, but it'd be great to know that. And then how did it all play out?
We um we had been approached by Bosch and Lomb at the time, and it was prior to their first acquisition. And they had expressed a lot of interest in the technology. And we had flown down to Florida and met with a group of the key opinion leaders and their executives, and everything was lining up perfectly. They got acquired and became what is now Bosch Health, and pretty much everybody from the VP level on up was gone. So I got to a meeting where I expected to have the next conversation on where we were going with the acquisition, and there was no one. And so we had gotten a little bit of interest from Retina at Alcon, which was now being run by a guy named Paul Hallen, who really became our champion. And I went storming out of our tiny little booth and went marching into the Alcon booth to try and figure out what in the world. I was all angry and walked right into Paul. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm, taking over the Retina franchise. And what are you guys doing? And we coincidentally had just had a surgeon over in Frankfurt, Germany, who had used the technology for a course that he taught, Frankfurt Retina, and he had used that and had wowed the audience with him being able to operate heads up, so that we had a whole bunch of people interested in what we were doing from the retina side. So Paul was the perfect person. Paul saw the technology, saw the recordings of retina, and said, I think this is our way in, because the anterior segment group within Alcon for doing cataracts and glaucoma and that kind of thing did not see the value. But Paul did. And so he said, look, if we can improve visualization in retina surgery, this is where this technology can go. And so that really started the conversation. Michael Onischek was new at Alcon at the time. Michael's now doing a neuro startup. But Michael at that time was president and was looking for new innovation, but they wanted to make certain that this wasn't just a couple of, crazy fringe ophthalmologists that were using the technology, that it could actually be used else, throughout the world, that people were really going to be able to operate with this. And so Paul said, I want you to go see this surgeon. And so I, flew to Phoenix, Arizona, and I operated with them. And the Alcon guys came in and they saw how this guy was using it. Fortunately, we had a chance to do about 4 or 5 cases before they ever showed up. Um, and so he was very facile and used the technology well. And then Paul said, well, sure, he can use it, but I need you to go to Florence, Italy and work with this guy. And so then, off to Florence. And so he kept sending me literally all over the world. And the surgeons would use the technology and report back to him and say, this is fantastic. And that really started the whole process of, okay, now we need to talk to you about, we'll distribute the product with you. And it was that partnership that got us our first $17 million, and got our first profitable quarter. And that was in 2016. So from the time that I joined the company in 2008 until then, we just hemorrhaged cash. And it was at that point that we finally started bringing in enough money that we could actually pay our bills. And that kind of came in dribs and drabs. Well, floods. I mean, we get a ton of cash and then we'd burn through
Mm.
all of that, and then we'd be back to borrowing money again, or getting investor money, and then we'd get another big order and we'd be off to the races again. But that was essentially how the relationship started and how they ended up funding our success.
That's incredible. So the people want the headlines of startups. People don't realize the instability, volatility of constantly needing more cash and burning through cash and raising cash and burning through cash and so forth, and the just you can never look sort of 6 months ahead of time. So then the distribution agreement comes in. The distribution agreement, I mean, looking back, is a massive. It feels like a perfect way for both parties because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it feels like you guys got what you needed for the business to really get the product out at scale, with using Alcon Salesforce and probably their lower cost way of selling. Um, and they got to test the product at scale to see if it was worth acquiring, right?
Right.
It felt like an incredible harmony. Was that the plan, and was the acquisition that followed later part of that plan initially, or something that got added on later on?
So the goal was always be acquired,
Okay.
and the goal was be acquired by, and then that changed over time. We didn't know who, because we kept seeing, this is something that a giant organization like a GE Health or a Siemens,
Yeah.
one of those, this is something that they ought to have. Zero interest. They had no idea what we were even talking about.
Why do you
Um,
think they weren't interested? Companies at that size?
I think that they looked at the landscape. I remember having a meeting with the Siemens guys at the JP Morgan meeting. And the Siemens guys said, but we'd have to compete against Zeiss. And the Zeiss sales team is a juggernaut. There's no way that we could possibly go up against them. And while there was a little bit of competing against Zeiss, there wasn't really a bunch, because the Zeiss guys were all, as we said, brass and glass. They were selling microscopes. Terrific, sell the microscope, because I need your microscope to put my camera on.
Right.
So it wasn't competitive in that arena, but where we were going in developing a digital microscope was absolutely going to be competitive to them. And the bigger companies just didn't have the stomach to go out and try and compete against Zeiss or a Leica, owned by Danaher, those folks.
Mm.
And,
So the
and and yet you get some young, scrappy startups that are saying, I'll take on, Goliath. Watch me run.
Yeah.
So
So then, but the acquisition was intentional, and the agreement between yourselves and Alcon gave this. How long was the distribution period and agreement before the acquisition was made formal?
2 years. So
Mm.
we and it really wasn't on any kind of a schedule other than we had engaged with the business development team and they were going through all of the modeling and trying to figure out, can we give them credit for this? Will we really sell this many in, the EU versus Asia? And eventually we'll get to China, but in the US, which is going to be the largest market, what's our percentage, penetration in there? And so you'd see these different business models. And of course, we're saying that we can sell to absolutely everybody in every single country, and they're saying, yeah, you're not going to sell that many, and you're never even going to get into this country, and these guys won't have the money to buy it, and so there was that kind of back and forth that we were having with their business development team. But the most important thing were the boots on the ground. And that was where we spent the vast majority of our time, was working with the sales team, because those innovators and early adopters of the sales team were out there taking what we had taught them and going out and being successful. But it was the rest of the sales team that fell on that bell curve, that we were out there really trying to either, in this case, do everything for them, and on the front side of the bell curve, teaching them how to do it, so that if they needed to bring me in for a couple of deals, they would eventually get it, and then they would be off running on their own. But it was a lot of time that we recognized we needed to make them successful, not continue to sell the promise. So there was this shift internally in our own thinking of, all right, now we've got them in the boat. Now we need to just roll like hell. And that
Yeah.
was that turned out to be the best thing that we did, was make them successful, and then they had to have the technology, because at that point they'd gotten their name on it, and so there
Mm.
was no walking away from the deal.
Yeah. Final valuation of the company at the time of acquisition?
150 million for the ophthalmology assets. And we had the neurosurgical side of the business as well as the ophthalmology side. We were trying to convince Alcon that they needed to be in neurosurgery, which they said ick. And so we said, all right, well, then let's split the company and we'll set up a new co that will take everything that is outside of ophthalmology, and you'll just buy the ophthalmology assets. And Alcon was perfectly fine with that.
Wow. So there was a good 8 years of perseverance, times where you might have probably felt like you weren't going to make it sometimes.
Almost every
Cash
morning.
coming almost every morning, cash coming in, cash going out quicker.
Yeah,
And then eventually well strategized distribution plan and an acquisition for 150 million. I
right.
mean, it's an incredible story. You must look back on it and just go, what a time in my life. What a story. Is it some of the most enjoyable years of your life?
In hindsight, which is unfortunate that it always works that way, right? I mean, you look back on it and you think those were the
Yeah,
best days,
yeah,
and yet when you're in it, it's just like, how do I even get out of bed in the morning to go and get my ass handed to me again? It just became very difficult. I remember one of the worst days that I had. We had met with Medtronic on the neurosurgical side. So I was up in Boulder, and they looked at it and just said, "You guys are insane." and deals weren't getting done, and it was, I wasn't making anywhere near the kind of money that I really wanted to be making, and the Alcon thing hadn't happened yet, and nothing was going right. And
Mm.
I remember stopping at a stop sign at about 5 o'clock in the morning, heading back to Denver Airport, and hadn't slept much the night before. And I just put the car in park, and I thought, I'm done. I'm
Mm.
quitting. I'm out. I've given this all I can give it. I've got to go find another job. And I just remember having that doubt of, are we ever really going to get there? And I don't know what came over me, but I put the car back in drive and said, all right, one more day. I'm going to give it
Yeah.
the rest of today, and I'll do everything that I can to be successful. And you just kind of get out of that. But I distinctly remember sitting there thinking to myself, I this is crazy, and I can't do this. And yet, we bootstraps, and you get back in, and you dust yourself off and go back into the fight again. And those, I think, those are the memories that I have, that I think I'm most proud of, was just getting up and going back in, and doing the fight another day.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. The
It's been a
story
ton of
is
fun.
yeah, it's been the story itself is amazing. As I said at the start of the show, it's the story that at a headline level everybody wants to say that they've done, but people don't necessarily understand the true meaning of startup and through to successful exit. It's years of stress, perseverance, and uncertainty. You can sit here and say you've done it and come out the other side for the positive. And that's why I think people love these stories. So I appreciate you taking the time to tell it because it's fantastic.
Absolute pleasure. Good to see you, David.
Thank you so much, Mark. Great to have you on.
You bet.
Thanks for listening to the show. I hope it was insightful and inspiring. This podcast is brought to you by Alevra Consulting. We are a commercially focused recruitment agency focused on medtech and life sciences. If we can help you in your job search, or if you're hiring commercial talent, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, David Philby, or at our website, alevraconsulting.com. Thanks again.